Hola. How are you, Minister? I welcome the opportunity to speak on the issue of directly elected mayors. I think a groupthink opinion has developed, and it appears the majority of the opposition parties and TDs in this House, from Fianna Fáil to the Greens and all in between, support the idea without being able to offer any meaningful explanation as to how the role would actually work. What we can all probably agree on is that local government in Ireland is in desperate need of urgent reform. In fact, we don't really have local government, we have poorly funded local administration. Consecutive governments, starting with Fianna Fáil in the 90s, have whittled away the power of local authorities, and we are now probably the most centralised governed country within the European Union. However, I am not convinced that the introduction of a directly elected mayor will solve the issue. The argument for a directly elected mayor appears to be as follows. If Dublin or Galway or Cork had a single recognisable figurehead who had been directly elected by the people, this person would have a mandate to use their executive powers to fix any problem that arose. It all sounds too good to be true, and that's because it is. Instead of making vague statements as to why we may need an elected mayor, these parties and the government should examine how the model has worked in the UK over the last 15 years. Over 20 years ago, before he became a war criminal, Tony Blair, on the verge of becoming Prime Minister for the first time, was using similar rhetoric to that of our current political parties when he stated, "The heart of the problem is that local government needs recognised leaders if it is to fulfil the community leadership role. People," he said, "and outside organisations need to know who is politically responsible for running the councils." Blair's love of all things American, including its mayoral system, resulted in the Local Government Act 2000. Among the reforms contained in the Act was the possible adoption by local governments of a directly elected mayor model of local government. Residents of a city could vote through referendum to have their city governed by a directly elected mayor. Towns and cities would still retain councils, the plan being that both would work together, with the final responsibility residing with the mayor. Since the introduction of this legislation, there have been 53 referendums in the UK, resulting in only 16 of the 326 UK cities and towns voting to be governed by an elected mayor. Although lack of appetite for the proposal does not necessarily equal failure, when one analyses a particular city that has adopted the model and compares it to the city's previous administration of local government, a study found that very little change occurred in terms of policy output and spending. Research of the 16 cities has shown that directly elected mayors are just as dependent on central government for funding, that their introduction does not lead to the sudden upheaval in a city's fortunes or spending power, and that it is extremely difficult for a mayor to exert influence over specific policy areas. Take the city of Liverpool as an example, which has a similar city population to Dublin, excluding the suburbs and other boundaries, approximately 500,000. For the year 2011-12, the city had a standard cabinet leader council model. In that year, the city spent 64% of its annual budget on social services, which included education, housing and social care. Following year, 12-13, the city of Liverpool voted for the elected mayor model, and figures show that it now spends 62% of its annual budget on social services, almost identical. The new mayor had no choice but to work with the existing council, and the same would happen in Dublin or Galway were it to adopt such a position. Not only have mayors in the UK been unable to exert any real power, they haven't even been taken seriously by the citizens of the towns and cities, and you would hardly blame them. In Hartlepool in 2002, voters elected the mascot of the team's football team, Angus the Monkey, as their first mayor. His campaign slogan was "Free bananas for the school children," which is actually not a bad idea. He won 2 more consecutive elections, served 10 years. Hartlepool voted to get rid of the directly elected mayor and return to its original cabinet leader council back in 2013. Surprise. Comparisons to cities such as New York or London are also not helpful. The mayor of New York has a budget of $60 billion and appoints the police commissioner. The US, as we know, is a federalist system, and therefore local government is established by each state, not federal government. They are not dependent on central government for funding or powers. This is why the US system actually works, The UK model has failed, and the Irish model would also more likely fail. Similar to New York, London is also raised as an example as to why we should adopt the mayor. But London is not only a city, it's a region. Yes, it has a directly elected mayor, but it also has a minister for London, a regional government office and a regional budget, as well as 32 councils in the various 32 boroughs. These 32 councils are responsible for the majority of local services, such as education, social services, waste collection and roads. In order for the Irish mayor to work like the US system, he or she would have to hold significant executive powers, but to date I have yet to hear anyone outline where these powers will come from. They will need to be taken away from somebody who has already had them, and we don't do that too easily in Ireland. If a mayor were to exert real influence over a city, they'd need similar powers to those vested in the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Transport and the Minister for Climate Action. Given that for the last 25 years, consecutive governments have diluted the role of local government, the chances of doing a complete U-turn on this policy is pretty unlikely. In fact, it's probably delusional. As well as ministerial powers, in order for a mayor to work, they would also need similar powers that are currently vested in semi-state organisations like the National Transport Authority and CIE. The newly created Land Development Agency, probably the worst thing that's happened in this chamber as far as I'm concerned since I came in here in March 2011. But this Land Development Agency will have significant powers to source sites and land. Will the mayor be given similar powers? NAMA still have significant powers. They control most of the development of the Dublin Docklands. Will a directly elected mayor be able to challenge NAMA's use of their powers? Or will he be given similar powers when NAMA are finally disbanded? Well, the truth be told, the Land Development Agency is NAMA Mark II anyway, so this is going to run and run and run and run and run. And they will continue to provide use the mechanism to provide unaffordable housing to the people of Ireland at a huge cost, given that they're going to engage developers who look for between 60,000 and 80,000 a unit profit for themselves. Expecting you to give that authority to a mayor, I don't actually expect it to happen. There's a growing trend in this House of legislation being put forward that goes against empirical evidence and data, and instead is drafted on the basis of if it sounds good, it must be good. Last week, a justice bill on sexual offences was passed which went against all the empirical data, yet the government allowed it to advance to appease its coalition partners. It was a load of rubbish. The introduction of directly elected mayors is similar in this nature. It sounds like a great proposal. All the opposition can get behind it, and they can call and sell it to their constituents as something that will solve the problems in their cities or towns. But when you drill a bit into the proposal, there's not much detail. And analysis of our nearest neighbours, who operate a similar system of central and local government as ourselves, shows that the introduction of directly elected mayors has not actually worked for them, and you could argue that has been a bit of a disaster. I therefore welcome the Minister's decision to hold a Citizens' Assembly to examine the proposal of introducing the office of directly elected mayor in Dublin. But I would ask the Minister to suspend the proposed plebiscites in Cork and Galway and allow the Assembly to examine the overall proposal in relation to the whole country, not just Dublin. If we were to do it like we would like to dream about how it should be done, fine. It works for cities in America. But unless we are prepared to go down that road and take so much power away from others and give it to the new mayor, we're wasting our time. And this is just another sham. Looks good, sounds good, going nowhere. The mayor will just be a tool of the local authority who has very little funding, totally dependent on central government, and will more than likely end up just costing the state more money without any merit coming from it. And God knows, if it was an opposition bill and not a government one, it wouldn't get the money message Imagine the occupied territories not getting the money message yesterday. That's actually a new law for that scheme to stop bills progressing. A new law. The notion that it was opposed on the basis that introducing criminal offences could cost the state money, that it could be open to challenges. Every piece of legislation that was ever introduced in this place since the state was founded was open to challenge. Absolute bollocks.
No, not very parliamentary language.
Well, Your Honour,
Do you want to withdraw?
I'm probably not the most parliamentary member. Maybe I'm not really suited to the place at all.
No, you're elected member to the House, and